My brother bullied me my whole life. Now he needs my kidney. Our parents expect me to save him, but I'm not sure I can. Years of pain and guilt hang over me. This choice will change everything. Growing up, my older brother, Jake, was the star. He was 3 years older and always seemed to have everything going for him. Good at sports, popular in school, always the one our parents doted on. He could do no wrong in their eyes. It didn't matter that, at home, he made my life a living nightmare. To the world, Jake was the golden child. To me, he was a bully. The teasing started early. He'd call me names, make fun of how I looked, how I acted, anything he could use to tear me down. Sometimes it escalated to shoves, kicks, or accidental hits that left bruises. But every time I'd tell our parents, they'd shrug it off with a dismissive, "That's just how brothers are." To them, it was harmless, settling rivalry. But to me, it felt like Jake had been given free rein to make my childhood hell. As we got older, the bullying didn't stop. It just became more subtle. It was clear Jake didn't see me as his equal, and our parents continued to turn a blind eye. By the time I was old enough to leave for college, I didn't look back. I was ready to finally live without the shadow of Jake looming over me. College was my escape. For the first time in my life, I was free from Jake's constant torment. No more snide remarks, no more accidental shoves, no more feeling like I was invisible to my own family. I finally had the space to figure out who I was without Jake's shadow hanging over me. For the first few years, I barely spoke to him. In fact, I barely spoke to my family at all. Calls with my parents were brief and focused on updates about Jake, how well he was doing, how much they missed him. They rarely asked about me, and I never offered much. I built my own life, made new friends, and tried to heal from the years of emotional scars my brother had left behind. But even as I moved forward, there was still a part of me that carried the weight of my childhood. The memories of Jake's taunts, the feeling of being constantly overlooked by my parents, it stayed with me. I thought I could just put it all behind me, but the truth was, those scars were still there, buried just beneath the surface. I never imagined that after all these years, Jake would need something from me. Something as big as a kidney. Something I wasn't sure I could give. A few weeks ago, I got the call that changed everything. My parents sounded panicked, their voices full of urgency in a way I had never heard before. Jake was sick, really sick. He had some kind of kidney issue, and it was bad enough that he needed a transplant to survive. The weight of their words settled over me like a heavy fog. My brother, the one who had made my life miserable, now needed my help to stay alive. The next thing they asked hit me like a punch in the gut. Would I get tested to see if I was a match? My parents were clear. They expected me to do it. It was my duty as his sister, they said. I listened in stunned silence, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. After everything Jake had put me through, was it really my responsibility to save him? I didn't give them an answer right away. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me still loved my brother, despite everything. But another part of me, the part that had spent years picking up the pieces of my shattered self-esteem, wasn't sure if I could forgive him. After the call, my parents didn't stop. Every few days, they'd reach out asking if I had made a decision. The pressure was unbearable. They didn't see me as a person with my own feelings or hesitations. To them, I was just Jake's sister, and that meant I had an obligation to save him. My mom would leave me emotional voicemails about how family is everything, and my dad would call me selfish for even hesitating. "You can't let your brother die because of some grudge," he'd say, as if it were that simple. The thing is, Jake never reached out, not once. No apology, no acknowledgement of the years of torment he'd put me through. It was as though he still didn't care about me. I was just the convenient match, the solution to his problem. And yet, my parents acted like I was the one being unreasonable. They couldn't understand why I wasn't jumping at the chance to help. The guilt was eating away at me. Every time I thought about Jake, I felt conflicted. Yes, he was my brother, but I couldn't forget the past. Could I really risk my own health for someone who had treated me like I didn't matter? The guilt was relentless. My parents were relentless. It was like every conversation we had circled back to the same question. When are you going to get tested? Their voices, once comforting, now felt like chains pulling me toward a decision I wasn't ready to make. They painted me as selfish, uncaring, and cold-hearted. My mom's words stuck in my head, playing on repeat. If you don't do this, you'll have to live with the consequences for the rest of your life. I was already living with the consequences of growing up with Jake. The teasing, the bullying, the emotional bruises. It had all left me with deep scars. Now, it felt like I was being asked to erase those years of pain with a single act. But it wasn't that simple. My parents couldn't see that I had my own fears too. I wasn't in perfect health myself. What if something went wrong? What if giving up a kidney made my life harder down the road? The more I thought about it, the heavier the burden felt. It wasn't just about saving Jake's life. It was about sacrificing part of my own. And yet, every time I pictured him in that hospital bed, I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my chest. The guilt was bad enough, but then came the memories. I found myself replaying moments from our childhood, things I hadn't thought about in years. Jake calling me loser every time I tried to speak up. The way he would push me into walls or trip me as I walked past him. The feeling of being completely invisible to my parents, who would dismiss it all with a casual, "That's just how brothers are." The worst part was, I had never really confronted it. I had stuffed it all down, telling myself that moving away and starting fresh was enough. But now, with the possibility of donating my kidney on the table, all that buried pain was clawing its way back to the surface. I realized that I never got closure. Jake never apologized, never showed even a hint of regret for the way he treated me. And now I was expected to give up a piece of myself, literally, to save him. I wondered if my parents ever realized how much damage those years had done to me. Did they know that I had spent years trying to rebuild my confidence, trying to believe that I was worth something, despite the way Jake had treated me? Or was I still just the little sister who should fall in line and do what's expected? With every passing day, the pressure to decide grew heavier. I felt like I was being pulled in two directions. One part of me still cared about my brother, despite everything, and the other part was screaming for me to protect myself. The more I thought about donating my kidney, the more I realized this wasn't just about family or obligation. This was about my own health, my future, and my ability to move on from the past. I had looked up the risks of kidney donation. Even though most people live normal lives with one kidney, there were still potential complications. What if something went wrong during surgery? What if my body didn't recover well? What if I faced future health issues because of this? My own health wasn't perfect either, and I had always been cautious about taking care of myself. How could I make such a huge decision when the person I would be helping hadn't even shown me basic kindness? My parents didn't seem to care about those risks. To them, it was simple. Jake was their son, and I had the ability to save him. But what about me? Did I owe him that after everything? The weight of this decision felt like it was crushing me. The closer I got to making a decision, the more conflicted I became. It wasn't just about my brother anymore. It was about the years of pain, the years of feeling unseen, and now, the pressure to fix everything with one selfless act. My parents acted like donating my kidney was a no-brainer. They couldn't understand why I was hesitating, why I wasn't rushing to the hospital to get tested. They saw it as my duty, blood ties, and family obligation. But all I could think about was the blood ties that had left scars, not bonds. I kept asking myself, could I truly help Jake without feeling resentful? Even if I went through with it, would it actually heal the years of hurt? Or would it deepen them, knowing I had sacrificed a part of myself for someone who had never really cared about me? The thought of him living, healthy, never once acknowledging my pain, terrified me. And the fact that he hadn't even reached out to me, no apology, no conversation, spoke volumes. It wasn't just my parents' guilt I was battling, it was Jake's silence. And yet, I couldn't escape the overwhelming fear of losing him. The thought of his life hanging in the balance haunted me. He was my brother, no matter what. I hated him for what he had done, but the idea of him dying, of being the one who could save him and choosing not to, was crushing. I was standing at a crossroad, and every choice felt like losing a piece of myself. Either way, I knew things would never be the same. The silence between Jake and me was deafening. Every day that passed without a word from him made the decision harder. It wasn't just the lack of an apology, it was the complete absence of any communication. If Jake truly needed me, why hadn't he reached out? Did he still see me as nothing more than his little sister, someone whose existence was convenient only when it benefited him? His silence spoke louder than any words ever could. I had spent so many years trying to move on, trying to heal from the damage he had caused. I had built a life without him in it, and I was finally at a place where I felt like I had escaped the worst of my past. Now, out of nowhere, I was being dragged back into it, all because of this one decision. My parents didn't see it that way. To them, I was the one in the wrong. I was the one holding a grudge, letting the past dictate my choices. They kept reminding me that Jake was family, that I had an obligation to help him because, after all, family sticks together. But what about the family that hurt me? The family that turned a blind eye to years of pain and then expected me to forget it all when they needed something. I tried to explain this to my parents once, but it was clear they weren't interested in hearing it. They only saw the present situation. Jake was sick, and I had the power to save him. Everything else was irrelevant. Deep down, part of me wished Jake would just talk to me, acknowledge the years of hurt, and offer some kind of olive branch. Even if it didn't erase the past, it would at least show that he had changed, that he saw me as a person and not just a solution to his problems. But instead, he stayed silent. Maybe it was pride, or maybe he didn't think he owed me anything at all. Either way, it made the decision all the more agonizing. I had spent sleepless nights thinking about what would happen if I didn't help. What would my parents think of me? Would they hate me? Would they cut me off for good? And what about Jake? Could I live with the guilt of knowing I might have been the only person who could save him? Every scenario ended with me feeling like the bad guy, even though I had every right to protect myself. In the end, the silence wasn't just coming from Jake. It was within me too. I couldn't decide. Every option seemed like a betrayal, either to my family or to myself. And no matter which path I chose, I knew the scars from this decision would last a lifetime. The day came when I had to make a decision. My parents' calls were more frequent now, their voices tinged with desperation. Jake's condition was worsening, and they were running out of time. I knew this would be the last conversation before everything changed, whether I decided to help or not. I sat with the phone in my hand for what felt like hours, staring at it, trying to steady my breath. The weight of their expectations pressed down on me, but I knew this decision wasn't just about them. It wasn't just about Jake. It was about me, my health, my peace of mind. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself think about what I needed. I had spent so many years of my life sacrificing parts of myself to keep the peace. I had pushed down my pain to make my parents happy. I had silenced my voice to avoid conflict with Jake. But this time, I couldn't afford to lose another part of myself. Donating a kidney was no small thing. It would change my life forever, and it wasn't a decision I could make lightly. My health wasn't perfect either, and that had to matter. I finally picked up the phone and called my parents. The moment I heard my mom's voice, I felt a pang of guilt rise in my chest, but I pushed it down. I had made my decision, and I knew there was no turning back. "I'm not going to do it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought maybe the line had cut out, but then I heard my mom inhale sharply. "What? You're not going to help your brother?" I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. "No, I'm not. I've thought about it a lot, and I just can't. It's not something I can do." The next few minutes were a blur of raised voices, accusations, and guilt-laden words. My mom cried, and my dad shouted. They couldn't believe I would abandon Jake like this, especially when his life was on the line. They called me selfish, heartless, said I was holding on to old grudges when I should be focused on the present. I let them speak, their words washing over me like waves crashing against a rock, but I didn't waver. This wasn't about a grudge. This was about protecting myself. For once, I was putting my needs first, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. I had spent too long apologizing for simply existing in Jake's world. The call ended with my parents hanging up on me. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and overwhelming sadness. I had made my choice, but it didn't feel good. It didn't feel like a victory. How could it, when my family now saw me as the villain in their story? Days passed without another word from my parents. I knew they were angry, and I wasn't sure if they would ever forgive me. The weight of their disappointment hung heavy on my shoulders, but I didn't regret my decision. I had finally chosen myself, something I had never done before. It wasn't easy, and it didn't feel like a happy ending, but it was a step toward healing. As for Jake, I never heard from him. Maybe he was too proud, or maybe he truly didn't care. I realized then that I had been holding out hope for an apology, for some kind of acknowledgement of the pain he had caused me. But Jake wasn't going to give me that. He never had, and he probably never would. And that was something I had to accept. Life moved on, as it always does. The guilt still lingered, especially when I thought about Jake's condition. But over time, I started to see things more clearly. I wasn't responsible for saving him. I wasn't responsible for fixing the broken family dynamics that had caused so much pain. I had a right to say no, to protect my health and my peace, even if it meant facing the wrath of my family. It wasn't the happy ending I had once hoped for, but it was real. It was my ending. I had finally stepped out of Jake's shadow, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing in the light,